in 1 or 2 minutes.
Welcome to the session, everybody. I can see from the attendees list that we've got at least 20 people here, which is very exciting. Some people I know, some people I don't. So welcome everybody to session 1.3. We're going to be starting in a few minutes. All the presenters are lined up and ready to talk with you. We're starting in about a minute. Welcome to those of you that have just joined us. If you look at the attendees list in the button, I think you should have on your screen, you'll be able to see who else is in the Aircast studio with you. I think we should start. Presenters already? So our first presenter today is Kneale. Dylan, are you ready to kick off?
Yeah, I think somebody has to stop sharing and then I can share. I think
You can share, and once you share, I'll put you up on screen with your slides.
Okay.
Oh,
share button.
Oh, it's me. I've got to take down mine. Sorry, it's my fault.
Cool.
It's always somebody.
Oh, great. Yeah. Okay.
It's working. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Hope you can see things. Okay, I'll start then. Welcome to the this presentation on understanding and representing complexity through logic models. This is the first of 5 presentations from work that we've been undertaking at the EPPI-Centre, looking at ways of handling complexity in evidence from public health interventions, and in particular thinking about the role of context. And we sought to develop methods for addressing context, which involved the reanalysis of existing meta-analyses. And we came from a perspective of asking a series of questions a decision maker might have about the findings of a meta-analysis. And where we started was through theorizing what was important about context to explore in a meta-analysis. And we used logic models as our tool to support this theorizing. We initially focused on childhood obesity. And this is work that was led by myself and Alison with Bridget, who's going to be talking next, Katie, Sandy and James at the EPPI-Centre, as well as Lizzie and Nick at the Co-Production Collective. So logic models are graphic models that facilitate the development and communications of assumptions around how an intervention works. And they're usually graphical assumptions. They usually provide directional expectations around chains of action. And most logic models that you may have seen in the literature are structured around inputs and outputs and short-term outcomes and long-term outcomes. So they're a form of program theory that depicts what actually goes into the intervention, what are some of the short-term changes, and what are some of the long-term outcomes that are theorized to occur. Systems-based logic models are slightly different. They focus more on the interactions between the intervention, the participants, and the context. And logic models are recommended in the literature to support systematic reviewers to theorise and make decisions about the conduct of the review. And within the literature around logic models, stakeholder involvement is also recommended in producing logic models. However, when I was asked for an example of where stakeholder involvement had made a difference to creating logic models, I was unable to supply an example. So we really wanted to focus in this project on the process of creating a logic model and documenting the change that stakeholder involvement can make to creating logic models. So we developed a process, and this roughly depicts the different stages that we undertook to develop our logic model. So we developed a rough plan of how to co-produce a logic model. So we thought that it would be good to, rather than involving stakeholders, to actually produce the model with people with lived experience, practitioners, researchers, and policymakers. We then consulted with an advisory group who advised us on how to have conversations about children's obesity. We then held our first project workshop where we gathered lots of data through online post-its. We then went away and mapped the data onto social ecological levels and thinking about different ecological levels of influence on children's obesity. We then checked our thinking with the advisory group. We held a second project workshop, again, co-developing this logic model, asking people what they thought were some of the influences on children's obesity. We then had lots of data to sort. So we sorted and grouped over 1,000 pieces of data. We then had to identify software and ways of representing all this data. And we kept on iterating the model to improve the clarity and ease the use of the model. And we undertook a further check and challenge in another workshop before then refining the model further. And underpinning all this was a co-production, the involvement of the co-production collective. So we worked with experts in co-production.
1 more minute.
Okay, so the model contains broad domains. It contains higher level factors, detailed level factors, and the connections between these. So this is a kind of depiction of the overall model. We then have more in-depth domains and different levels, and supporting each piece of data within the model is the actual data that was collected within workshops. So what participants said were important factors that influenced childhood health. Because some of the differences that stakeholder involvement did make was to change our focus away from obesity to thinking much more broadly about children's health. And to think about the intersection between physical activity, healthy eating, and mental well-being. It also changed the perspective of the review team throughout the development of the methods. We were much more aware of some of the factors around children's health, and it gave us a new lens for interrogating the data for later stages. But there's lots of limitations to our approach. In particular, we developed a really complex model. Evaluation comments of the model described a very busy model, and we needed to undertake more prioritization. We also were able to use the model within the later stages of the project to identify what was important about context, but there was lots within the model that wasn't represented in the data we were working with. So our conclusions around this is that the model helps to illuminate the gap between people's lived experiences and the types of questions that decision makers are asking about context and evidence and what's being reported in the literature. This kind of exercise is a useful check on the salience of the overall public health issue. Again, we swapped our focus away from more a narrow focus on children's obesity, which was viewed as stigmatizing, to a much broader focus on children's health and thinking about intersections of healthy eating, physical activity, and mental well-being. And through co-producing this project, we ultimately ended up with a much more nuanced and complex model. And this process was filled with stages of joy, but also there were setbacks. But ultimately, we had the process was enriching, and we developed a stronger model.
Well done.
I'll stop.
Thank you, Dylan. Very nice. You've got 1 minute for questions. Now, I'm not sure, Vivian, that people can use the question and answer session, but if anyone's got a burning question, they could ask it now, or we could have maybe a bigger session at the end of all presentations. But you said these are linked presentations, Dylan?
Yeah.
I see that Andrew Booth's hand is up in the attendees box. Perhaps.
Yeah, Andrew, take the mic. Just for a minute, Andrew. Take the mic. Not sure he can. Let's move on to the next presentation.
Just encourage him, Andrew, if I'm not sure if the mic is working, but you should be able to put your question in the live Q&A, and then Dylan, you could answer it there.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't get anything into the live Q&A, Vivian, so I don't know if we can get some assistance with that.
Okay.
It doesn't seem to be working. So our next presenter, which is a linked project, is Bridget Candy. Bridget, are you ready?
Yeah.
Over to you.
I don't see your slides up yet, Bridget.
Can you see them? No?
Not yet.
Ah, sorry. Maybe I didn't share.
Just while you're looking, there is one, Michelle tried out the live Q&A. And then Andrew has typed a question in there. Okay, I see your slides, but you're sharing yourself right now. So you, if you want to put them there on live full screen.
Is that right?
Yes, that's perfect. Yeah. Now you are showing with your slides. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm presenting on behalf of the CEFI project team the results of 2 of the novel review approaches we used. So the background to this project is that evidence from systematic reviews can be hampered by a limited exploration of the local context to which the trial was tested in. So here we set out to explore this at review level. The contexts we focused on were those of disadvantage, where the population, for example, was from a marginalized ethnic group. To do this, we borrowed from 2 analytical approaches: qualitative comparative analysis, QCA, and intervention component analysis, ICA. QCA uses set theory and structural analysis to identify conditions for intervention success or failure. QCA requires a deep, holistic knowledge of interventions trialed. It is case-orientated rather than variable-orientated, which is the approach we use in meta-analysis. QCA thereby allows reviewers to identify key components of critical features and multiple pathways to the same outcome. ICA seeks to understand interventions worked on the ground. It uses qualitative analysis techniques and draws on informal, evidence-based insights from trialists about what they felt that led to the success or failure of the trial or the intervention. So, led by our stakeholders from that logic model you saw, to test approaches, we selected a review of the impact of school-based physical activity interventions on mental health. The QCA data table on this slide presents the characteristics of the 21 studies included in this review. We ordered these studies by their impact on mental health from 0 to 1, with 0 no impact on mental health to 1 being the greatest impact on mental health. Across the table, as you can see, the data was sparse, so we could not go on any further in our QCA analysis. However, we noted that there was only 1 study in a disadvantaged population in the greatest impact group, whereas where interventions had no impact, all were tested in disadvantaged populations. So one conclusion from this is that it is perhaps challenging to achieve successful outcomes in contexts of disadvantage. However, QCA has a complexity theory perspective in which it is expected that contextual and intervention features will interact to impact on outcome. This we noticed when we used ICA. So on this slide are two examples of this. Contextual fit we see in a study in the greatest impact group, and this is the one that involved a disadvantaged group. Here, reasons the authors felt it worked included the adolescents could see impact quickly, that they were individually challenged at appropriate level, and that the intervention had a good fit to the school environment. In contrast, we see in this example a lack of fit in this study from the minimal impact group. Here, why the trialists felt it may not have worked included failure to engage teachers and parents, and that the nutritional lessons which were part of the intervention may not have been appropriate for low-income families. So because of such insights we found on contextual fit, we looked for theory about how physical activity interventions may fit the psychosocial needs. We drew on the conceptual model from Leuven's 2016, and we examined, as listed on the second row of this table, theory-informed psychosocial intervention conditions. These were an opportunity for social interaction, a sense of mastery, body image focus, and choice of activity.
One more minute, Bridget.
This was in addition to other possible conditions for impact we found in our ICA analysis. This was tailoring, whether the intervention was tailoring or whether it was fun. The trends we saw, noting the patterns of lighter and darker, so darker meaning that there's more of a connection, is that not only were the more successful trials delivered in non-marginalized populations, they're also far more likely to evaluate interventions with features designed to meet young people's psychosocial needs. So, in conclusion, our analysis identified potentially important interactions between context and intervention. And as trialists, we need to take on board that we need to consider, we should consider conceptual fit in the development of an intervention and also report context better. A future review that focuses uniquely in context of disadvantage, we believe may be able to identify more important intervention features for that context than we were able to in this early use of this approach.
Wonderful. Well done, Bridget. That's really, really, really interesting. Huge project that you're talking about here. So I can see questions popping up in the live Q&A. If the three of you or whoever, how many people are reporting on this project, can have a look at these and think about how to answer them in a minute. We've got 3 minutes now before I was going to kick off the next presentation. Does anybody want to answer any of those questions now? I can see there are some answers already been put in. Dylan or...
Yeah, just invite Dylan, if you'd like to come back on screen. There are 3 questions that you could answer live.
Okay, so I just so I can see a question by Andrew about whether the evidence revealed anything wrong with the model, and I think I was just responding. I think the main thing was that there's just lots in the model that wasn't covered in the studies. So I think it was more that we weren't really able to fully evaluate the model and look at the kind of connections in the literature for lots of what was happening in it. So I think that was a kind of another next stage that we'd want to do, is really to try and interrogate more of what was happening in the model. In terms of the Isabel's question, it was Miro that we used, and we kind of created an interactive website that I can post a link in the chat to allow people to kind of explore. So we kind of had different Miro boards linked together to try and represent the complexity. And I think they were the 2 questions. that I can see, but let me know if there's another.
Yeah, great.
Cool.
Bridget, I have a question for you because I don't see any in the chat. I thought that was really interesting about the fun factor. And I wanted to ask whether there's any association with the sort of the fun, the social engagement with engaging with people who are the intended beneficiaries. So whether engaging people in designing the trials helps, increase the fun. That's a bit of a question for you.
I don't think we necessarily looked at that. We certainly picked up whether they were involved in designing the intervention. But we were limited. We only had 21 studies, so we couldn't really see very much data. But we didn't. Maybe Katie will say otherwise, as she was the main designer of these approaches of how we tackled it. But so no, I can't say clearly that we saw an association, but there probably was. But
yeah.
That's
yeah. I think it's great. Thank you. Okay, I think Rebecca.
Yeah, time for Alison's session.
Hello.
Hi. We can hear you fine, Alison. The sound's fine.
Yeah, sorry if you hear the whirring throughout, but I'll hopefully get this working okay. So can you see my screen, I hope?
Yep.
So I'm presenting also from the CEFI project that Dylan and Bridget have been talking about. And as you probably picked up from the other presentations, it's all been inspired by this concern about using evidence from meta-analyses for local decision-making being hampered by the lack of explicit connection between the context in which the interventions were evaluated and the context in which the evidence is to be applied. So we've identified through, and other colleagues through other work, that we need new methods to address this question of, is there any evidence that this particular intervention that's been assessed through a meta-analysis will actually work differently in an area like mine? And so we developed and tested 4 different methods throughout this project, and Bridget just covered one in the last presentation. This presentation here, we're talking about one of the other approaches to synthesis that we call recalibration. So it's recalibrating the contribution of studies to the pooled effect size so that the most relevant studies contribute more than the less relevant studies to the pooled effect. So trying to simplify the process a little bit, this is a bit of a whirlwind tour of it, but the recalibration process for us started with using this co-produced logic model that Dylan discussed as an anchor to help us identify relevant characteristics that are important to the intervention and the local authority context that we'd want to try and apply this to. From that, having identified these particular characteristics, we then extracted these contextual characteristics from each study. So this will vary from review to review, but in the test case that we did this in, it was things like socioeconomic status, age, gender, a whole range of different things. We also looked for different characteristics such as because it was around school-based interventions to improve weight management for children and adolescents. And so we had a look for different factors that were identified around how many fast food joints were on the high street of the local area and things like that. So a whole bunch of different environmental and other different factors that were identified through the logic model. And so we tried to pull out whatever we can from each of the studies in the review. But then we wanted to complement this by adding in characteristics of the particular local authorities that we're testing this process on. So local authorities are just district areas within the UK. And we glean this information from secondary data sources. So in this case, mainly census data, but you could also use large secondary databases where you have location-based information, so local area information. So once we've got these 2 sets of information, the stuff from the studies themselves and the information from our secondary databases, We then had to harmonize the data, so create some rules for categorizing the data so that the data sets could speak to each other. And from that, we could create a dissimilarity matrix, which was based on these multiple factors. And there was very much this focus on trying to identify the factors that were most similar to the local authority we were interested in. And then we created a weight that included the sort of the regular, usual inverse variance weight that you'll be familiar with in a typical meta-analysis, and tau squared if you're doing the random effects model. But it also had this additional similarity coefficient that was derived through the process just discussed. For some reason it's not going to the next screen. There we go. So this is...
One more minute.
Oh. Okay, a brief snapshot of the forest plots before and after, so before on the left and after on the right. And the key thing that you can see here is indicated by the red circles, is that the confidence intervals around our effect size are much smaller afterwards once we've taken into account upweighting of the studies that were more similar to this particular test context. The test case here was Liverpool in the UK, but you can apply it to any local authority setting. And when you look at what's different between the two forest plots, the main difference is actually in the weighting of two studies, where one was upweighted more because it was more similar to the Liverpool context, and another was downweighted because it was less similar. So further interpretation of this is we're trying to address what a hypothetical decision maker's question would be, is there any evidence that this intervention would work differently in an area like mine, being Liverpool in this case? We found that if we upweight studies more similar and downweight studies are less similar, then we might actually be more confident about seeing an impact in Liverpool, this particular UK city. Some of the caveats around this approach is that the weighting doesn't lead to a perfect match. There's different factors also at the moment, the way we tested it contributed equally to the weight, but you may want to upweight even further particular factors that you think are extra important or downweight others. And you also need to decide which components to include in the weighting. We did it based on the logic model, but you'd need to find out what works in your context. And some of the advantages is that the interpretation for decision making alongside our usual approach, you can present both findings, the overall meta-analysis as you do in a traditional approach, and this recalibrated and kind of see what difference it makes. But importantly, it emphasizes the contextual factors that are relevant to your area. So the test case we did this on was the interventions for reducing fat intake. In the recalibration analyses, because the contextually relevant studies showed greater effects, the recalibrated pooled effect size actually indicated a larger effect with narrower confidence intervals. And we tested this over four different local authority areas, and we saw that difference in 3 of the 4. The 4th one was more or less unchanged. These findings held under both fixed and random effects specifications. And overall, we conclude that recalibration may give a contextually nuanced estimate for a given local context.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alison. We need to make sure we cover the last 3 sessions as well. So I'm going to ask you 3 presenters that have just been that you look at the Q&A and answer the questions that are in there by writing. And I'm going to welcome here Darren Moore. I think Rachel Proctor's are also with us, and they're presenting on using system mapping to conceptualize implementation in the school context. You ready to go, Darren?
Yep, I have just shared. Let me know when it's
there.
Can see that. Good to go.
Can see that. Go for it.
Wonderful. In that case, I will, and I will set myself a timer. So this is a different project and different lens in terms of implementation, but some of the previous discussion on co-produced logic models is relevant here and sets this up quite nicely. So in this short talk, I'm going to describe how we use system mapping as a methodological approach to conceptualize a complex topic as part of evidence synthesis. The integration of systematic review findings with consultation with educational stakeholders was a novel approach that we thought would be of interest to share here. The system map element is one part of an ongoing project funded by the Education Endowment Foundation, but has informed ongoing work. I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague Rachel Proctor, who Rebecca mentioned. She cannot be with us today, so please bear with me as I try and do justice to the work that she's led on and also the slides that she's prepared. So when we talk about school-based implementation, we're referring to how evidence gets put into practice, and in particular the processes schools undertake to put interventions and approaches into practice in their own context. Multiple theories, models and frameworks have been applied or developed to help explain implementation in schools. Some key assumptions we draw upon and make system maps relevant as a methodological approach are the idea that implementation is a process rather than event. It will span from identifying areas for improvement to efforts to sustain or even de-implement an approach that has been put into practice in schools. A wide range of factors or determinants will inform how an approach is implemented in school. Some will be features of the approach, some will be about individuals in the system or influences outside the school system. So it can often be thought of in terms of socio-ecological models that Dylan mentioned earlier. Implementation strategies or tools can then be considered to support implementation. So what are system maps and how can they help us to make sense of evidence, both from literature and from stakeholders? On the slide is an early version stemming from conversations with stakeholders. It does not matter if you cannot make out the detail, it is more to get a sense that there are factors which might be organized into different categories, and a key part is considering relationships between them in a system map. System maps are theories of change that provide thinking tools which can be used for exploring complex interventions. Hopefully I've indicated already how implementation in schools as systems can be thought of as complex. By drawing upon existing implementation theories, models and frameworks and insights from stakeholders, we were able to show how factors interact across various school contexts with a range of evidence. We undertook a systematic review of implementation theories, models and frameworks that have been applied in the school context. We extracted data from these studies, identified 58 theories in total that spanned 85 empirical or theoretical studies. In a second step, we synthesized these 85 papers, selecting factors related to pupil and implementation outcomes. Often more than one factor was considered in evidence, and this was of interest to us because it indicated where relationships may be present in the implementation process. Alongside this evidence synthesis, we also met regularly with stakeholders involved in implementation in schools. This helped us to kind of maintain the relevance to context and outcomes in practice. These discussions focused on gathering consensus around the key factors associated with school implementation. Here you can see a picture of a near final draft of the system map. It would take more than 5 minutes to introduce it and start to navigate it. So again, we're going to focus more on the method rather than findings in terms of school implementation. We quickly moved from using PowerPoint to using software called QMU, K-U-M-U, online software designed to develop system map style diagrams. Helpful things about QMU are the color and shape coding. For instance, the blue-green factors in the middle relate to features of implementation. It's helpful, as you can imagine, it's pretty overwhelming to navigate this system map, but you can click on a section of interest to just see that, or hover just over one factor and it shows all of those other factors it connects with. Unsurprisingly, we needed to think about a higher level map top right that indicates key categories as a way in for people to kind of view and think about the system map. To get here, a list of key factors was developed in response to stakeholder input and ongoing evidence synthesis. At the peak of this process, we had over 100 factors that appeared important. We refined it by focusing on factors present across common theories, models and frameworks linked to either pupil outcomes or implementation outcomes or both, but also perceived as key by stakeholders. And then there were various iterations of the map. An area where stakeholder involvement really helped was kind of how to organize these factors and make sense of it and the connections.
You finishing up, Darren?
I am finishing up.
Well
the map facilitates a view of school implementation not a roadmap from A to B, but as an interactive system of inquiry. Shows what was prominent in stakeholder experiences, but also evidenced in literature. I'll pop on the last slide just in case there are links of interest, but on reflection, mapping strengthened our understanding of school implementation, but also having it enabled us to appreciate the complexity going on, but inform survey and interview methods with school leaders and early thinking about our programme theory for an ongoing realist review. That's all. Thanks for your attention. Look forward to any questions.
Wonderful. Are there any questions in the chat, or would anyone like to take the mic?
There's one question in the chat, but I will type in the answer in terms of which software.
Gemma has asked, if you've got 100 relevant factors, who decides which ones to concentrate on?
We narrowed it down by focusing on the factors that were considered important by both stakeholders and also appearing in evidence and related to either implementation outcomes or pupil outcomes, which helped narrow it down from factors that either were only mentioned by stakeholders or only appearing in evidence, which wasn't always English schools based. Which helped, but there's still a lot of factors.
I bet. Any other questions for Darren? Anyone want to take the mic?
It's Vivian here. I was just going to say I turned on the audience reaction. So Darren, I hope that wasn't too distracting. If you got some clapping during your presentation.
I didn't hear any clapping, so I will just have to believe that it happened.
There
were some little bubbles of clapping and things going on, so we'll leave it on.
Yeah,
yeah.
We could see it, so I liked it. If there are no more questions for Darren, please feel free to put them in the live Q&A. There's another clap coming across the screen for you, Darren, right now. I'm going to welcome Miranda onto the main stage to present. Hi, Miranda.
Hello. Let me just see if I can share this okay. And let me know if you can see the slides coming up.
Yep, they are there. And now you should be set to go. Oh,
great.
There, that's better.
So what's that? You can see them okay?
Yep, perfect.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. Well, I'll start by just quickly acknowledging that I'm speaking today from the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people here in Melbourne in Australia, and pay my respects to them. I'm going to talk today about something that we call specifying the PICO for synthesis. So I'll just quickly run you through what I mean by that. Systematic reviews of interventions, as we all know, begin with articulating the research questions to be addressed. So there's often more than one question of interest within a review. For example, you might be comparing the effectiveness of more than one type of intervention, considering effectiveness for different population groups, and so on. So given the objectives of your review, the authors have to decide which studies should be grouped together for the purposes of synthesis, which groups might be considered separately, compared against each other, or considered in different ways. So, for example, in a review of workplace programs with pedometers for exercise, there could be programs with pedometers alone without any other support. You could have team challenges like Step Timber, which are part of a community program, step goals, fundraising, and so on. You might have more intensive health promotion programs that also target diet, provide personalized counseling, change the physical environment. There can be a lot going on. Now, we might want to combine all of these intervention types into a single analysis, but if we don't want to do that, we need to decide how we're defining the different groups or categories we're using. And each study will have different components and characteristics. So how do we decide if a particular study is a STEP program or a health promotion program? So we refer to this process of defining the groups as specifying the PICO or the eligibility criteria for each synthesis category within the review. In addition to intervention characteristics, the review might be handling contextual factors, population groups, making choices about outcome measures, choices about study characteristics, and there's a lot more detail about these kind of aspects in Chapter 3 of the current Cochrane Handbook. So for some of us, this might all seem very obvious. We all make these decisions in each review that we conduct, but it's really important because we want to minimize the risk of bias in our review. Decisions about which studies appear in which categories and which synthesis affect the results. So we want to avoid making selective post hoc decision making. We want to maximize transparency and reproducibility in the work that we're doing. And we want to make sure the readers and end users of our reviews share the same understanding of the research questions and the categories that we're using. In an ideal world, each review would clearly specify the groups of studies that were used to structure the synthesis, the role of those studies would be stated explicitly, and then we'd see those groups being used in practice. But how good are we in reality at clearly and accurately reporting the PICO for each synthesis? So to answer that question, we took a random sample of 100 published systematic reviews of interventions published in 2018 from 2 databases that index reviews in public health and health systems research. And we used standard systematic review methods to select the studies and extract data. In each review, we looked for the groupings that they identified and these 3 steps in the methodology. So this is a snapshot of some of the results that we found. And let's start by focusing on those intervention-based groups. Of our sample of 100 reviews, 42 had groupings that were based on intervention characteristics, and we had some evidence that there was a role for those groups in defining comparisons in the synthesis. Of those 42, 28 or 67% identified their intervention groupings in the text, for example, in the background or the methods of the review. 17 or 40% used the intervention-based groupings to structure the comparisons, but did not mention them in the background or the methods. And you'll notice that adds up to more than 100%. A few reviews had more than one intervention-based grouping, and they might have handled them differently. About half, or 21 reviews, explicitly specified the role the groups would be playing in structuring the comparisons. Around a quarter of the reviews defined all the groups in enough detail to replicate decisions about allocating included studies to the different groups. Around a third provided some kind of definition but incomplete, and the rest were those that weren't named or defined at all. Most of the reviews, about 90%, used their identified intervention groups in practice in the analysis, but we note there are many reasons why analyses don't always go as planned. So looking across these different grouping types, we can see that it wasn't unusual to find new groupings used to define the comparisons that weren't mentioned in the background or methods of the review. It was common for reviews to use groupings to define comparisons without explicitly stating that role, and about half or fewer of the groupings were defined in enough detail that we could replicate the allocation of studies to those groups. So these are really our key findings. It's common for reviews to use PICO-based groups to define the characteristics, comparisons without explicitly stating the role, without completely defining the groups, and sometimes without mentioning the groups in the methods at all. So as authors, we should recognize that when we're specifying research questions and structuring synthesis, it's an important area of methods, and we need complete and transparent reporting of the categories that we're using. So with that in mind, we're working on developing a tool for reporting that we're calling InSync, or the Intervention Synthesis Questions Checklist and Guide, a project that's supported in part by Cochrane. We're currently incorporating feedback from consultations conducted earlier in the year. But to give you a quick preview, it's a 10-item checklist structured aligned to those 3 stages I mentioned earlier, clearly identifying the groups, including a clear rationale, explicitly stating the role of each group in the synthesis, and then finally presenting the synthesis in accordance with the specified structure. An elaboration's been written for each item, and we've also got a collection of worked examples of complete and incomplete reporting. So thanks to everyone who's contributed to the projects. I'm very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Miranda. I don't think there's anything in the live Q&A at the moment, well, specifically for your presentation, but would anybody like to take the mic? You're getting thumbs up, applause, little things coming up on the screen.
Sharing the screen, yeah.
Oh, nice. Anybody like to take the mic to ask a question of Miranda?
Well, it's Vivian here. That was fantastic. I mean, I would think when is that tool going to be available for Campbell reviews?
Yeah, as I said, we're just in the final stages of incorporating the feedback we received, so it won't be long.
great. Excellent. So yeah, I do encourage people. So obviously, people are enjoying the reactions. That's great. And please do put questions in the live Q&A.
We'll have a little bit of time, hopefully, at the end of the session, so we can come back to Miranda after you've these ideas. There's so much being discussed, isn't there? Sort of bubble through our minds as we're hearing and seeing other people's questions. So, Karin, would you like to take the floor?
Sure. So our presentation is actually a collision of work across different continents. So we actually opted for a voiceover so that my co-presenters could also be heard. And Vivian was so kind to launch that from her machine so that everyone was able to hear the sound. So
wonderful. We can't hear the sound yet, Vivian.
No, Vivian, did you launch the video?
How is this?
Today, Kendra and I will speak as representatives of the multimodality methods group to share some of our recent insights in using storytelling as a subject of a systematic review project and storyboarding as a method of analysis in a systematic review. But we also speak on behalf of the many participants and citizens we were privileged to work with and who share their stories with us as a way of progressing our knowledge base. Storytelling techniques are one of the oldest methods available to share knowledge. Yet, as a review community, we might not have engaged with them substantially. We became involved in story-based methodology because of a sincere interest and deep respect for the material and environmental dimensions of our world and how matter actually comes to matter in the complex social phenomena we study. This opens up new possibilities to focus on the social production of evidence rather than the social construction of it. It invites us into participatory collection and analysis of evidence and to engage a multiplicity of different voices.
We are exploring and advancing storytelling as a method in primary research in our participatory scoping review. Our research team brings together 20 people, including Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers and Indigenous patients, elders, and healthcare professionals. Our purpose is to identify and examine how storytelling has been used as a method in Indigenous health research on Turtle Island, Australia, and Aotearoa. Our project has two intertwining approaches, a scoping review, but equally important is gathering together to hear teachings and stories from the elders and our Indigenous colleagues about Indigenous storytelling. We bring these two threads together in conversations at our relational gatherings, and we weave together these diverse ways of knowing to guide and shape our work. Here's a photo from our most recent landscapes gathering. Together we critically reviewed all published research using storytelling in Indigenous health research and developed a framework based on our synthesis of 178 studies to guide the respectful use of storytelling methods in future work.
We use storyboarding as a method of analysis and a qualitative evidence synthesis that explored HIV-infected young people's adherence to antiretroviral therapy in low to upper middle income countries. To do this, we used 8 steps which we developed in this paper. First being a documenting the individualist perspective, which looks at the interaction of items with one another. Second, we familiarize ourselves with the previous studies. We then identify and extract codes, quotes, and particular methods with which we created images of people. We then place these images onto a storyboard, which we interpreted into storylines. We revised, redefined, and read through the storyboard until we were able to provide a narrative in the first person account. Storyboarding was so useful in this period, and as you can see, that we started out with a very simple drawing, which was just ideas that we placed as we were reading. We then rediscovered the stories, through redefining the board. The board was able to be created digitally, so you don't feel comfortable drawing, you can do it digitally. We also used it as a means of dissemination. So easy translation, easy to create if you are doing interactive reading. Stories can be read through one another. They are easy to read in the result section. And also the reliability was tested when we worked with the storyboard and the group of HFPs together. With this contribution, we wish to highlight the importance of storytelling as one of the more powerful ways to put ideas into our collectively shared world. Not only because stories activate our imagination, but also because research has shown that our brains are hardwired to process and store information in the form of stories. At the same time, they may speak to a broader audience, which potentially increases the social impact of the work the Campbell collaboration is doing. Our multimodality methods group pushes forward review projects that speak to the idea of using multiple sensory and communicative modes as a subject of research, a method of research, and a way of disseminating knowledge. We welcome your capacity and intellectual ideas and wish to open the floor for comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Karin, and your fellow presenters, and for taking the time to make that presentation so accessible and bringing in all of your some of your collaborators as well. It's really wonderful to see these new ways of sharing things online when we're all far apart. So thank you very much for that. Do people have questions for Karin?
And for Kendra and Lynn, who are in the public, so they might attend to you through the chat box as well.
Fantastic. Please take the mic if anybody wants to. I have a question, Karin and colleagues. In reading a little bit about this, I've seen that people are saying we spend too much time on our screens and that storytelling maybe needs to return to a space that's away from screens. Have you had any thoughts about this and how this can be fitted in with your work?
Yes, indeed. I think Kendra's example really speaks to that, where she really went into dialogue with indigenous women and populations nearby and spoke things through around the table. The second slide might have shown that to you. Alternatively, we are also experimenting with, for example, priority setting exercises, where we invite people into creating art or being creative, designing things based on their personal experiences, so that you bring in this tactical dimension of working with your hands, with your ears, with your fingers, working with material dimensions to express some of the internal feelings you may have. So we definitely bring the work back to its tangible dimension. Yeah.
Thank you. I see a question in the chat from Ginny Brunton over in Canada early in the morning. Ginny asks, I may have missed it, but what kind of software supports this method?
Lynn, could you attend to that? Because I think it links to your part where you showed the storyboard that was electronically generated. Are you able to use the pencil, Lynn?
I'm not sure if she's able to use the pencil.
Okay.
I'm really sorry, this platform.
There is, I mean, in general, Ginny, I'm not sure which one Lynn used, but there is a lot of storyboarding software available, many different programs, from a basic program such as the one that Lynn uses up to more advanced programs where you can really write scenarios as well. So if you combine software with storyboarding, you'll hit a massive amount of options there, and I'm sure that some of them will suit your goals.
Thank you both. There was a question from that posted by Vivian in the presenters chat, which was from Miranda, who said, I think she was talking about one of the earlier presentations, saying, thank you, but with all the new tools available, do you think it will be difficult to get authors to embrace new approaches? And I think that's something that all of us could maybe reflect on today. We're all trying out, maybe some of us are trying out this new conferencing software for the first start. Sometimes it can feel a bit overwhelming for me. Vivian says Lynn has put an answer in the live Q&A as well. Does anyone have any thoughts about that question? Getting other authors to embrace these approaches?
Yeah, I mean, from my side, I think we made it clear in the presentation that sometimes the things that come most natural to us, like storytelling, are the things we abandon first in education and in science. So what we are trying to do is move back to some of the origins of how we tend to share knowledge and how we have consistently done that over time without the tools and without the software. And the software is then seen as a medium that makes it more appealing and more easy for us to navigate stories again.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So Lynn has posted in the chat that they used PowerPoint and free online images from Google, and also used Infogram and Miro for thinking through storylines. We've still got just under 3 minutes until the end of our session. So if anybody wants to revisit any of the earlier presentations or the later presentations, please, now's your chance. Add your questions, answer questions, take the mic.
I have a question while people are thinking of a live Q&A. We have some later sessions by Patrick Ockwin from Cameroon, Karin, and he uses storytelling approaches as a knowledge translation approach. So I guess my question is, have you worked together? Because this sounds like a great opportunity for collaboration.
No, we haven't worked together, and I'm keen in inviting that person.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to introduce you. Patrick Ockwin was just awarded the Campbell Collaboration Robert Baruch Award for his work with storytelling as a knowledge translation tool. So I see everyone's coming on for the last 2 minutes. Great.
So people can see our smiles. Any more questions? How do you advise those without academic backgrounds make use of such new tools, says Braden? Personally, it doesn't help being an academic. Sometimes I feel less able to use these new tools. I ask my children. And Michelle has asked, for Alison, what's the benefit of recalibration versus standard moderator analysis? Maybe that's a long one for a written response. I don't see Alison here right now. Oh, yes, there you are. Hi. Do you want to answer that one in the next 45 seconds?
Pressure. The main thing, I suppose, is that you can tweak the calibration for each particular local authority area that you want to adapt to. So you can identify the characteristics of each area and put in the numbers that are relevant for each area. So you'd be weighting different studies depending on which local authority you're looking at. So it's a bit more flexible and adaptable to your local context. It's amazing.
Fantastically concise, Alison. You've all been wonderful. Thank you. So impressed at how everybody squeezed it all in 5 minutes. Everyone should clap themselves now and send some more of those nice emojis coming through. And look forward to seeing you during the rest of the sessions today, tomorrow, and Thursday. Thanks, everybody. Give yourself a nice round of applause.